Thank you all for being here for this panel. So we have four speakers, and the first is Nguyen, who is the former Minister for Trade and Industry. And he'll be speaking on the private sector and economic development in the Rvn. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm going to talk about, as the title shows you, how we spend time develop the private sector and the economic development of the Republic of Vietnam during wartime. I'd like to talk about land reform first, because that was one of the major projects that we undertook that time. Why do we need land reform? It may be something that you've heard before, but I like to emphasize this is a typical project that gives pride of ownership to the farmers, or to the tenants that have been working the farm for generations, and for the first time they own the land that they have been working on for generations without owning it. Second idea is to create small holdings. We do not want large holdings again. And finally, we want to give ownership to the people who have intimate knowledge of the business. They've been working the land, they know the risk, they know how to deal with those risks. Under the First Republic, we had land reform, but it was not carried out successfully for a few other reasons. I don't want to get into the details, but I want to go into the Second Republic, where we thought we had a better program and we carried it out successfully. Within a special 3 years, we have distributed 1.1 million hectares of land, about 40% of the land. Basically, by 1974, the land tenancy had disappeared in South Vietnam. And by end of 1974, we have reached level where we could say that we are self-sufficient in rice, whereas we've been importing rice for the last 10 years, as many as 600,000 tons of rice per year. How did we achieve that? In many ways, fairly simple. Market pricing, application of technology to give better yield for the same plot of land, and finally, we give them enough credit so that they can afford to buy agricultural machinery in order to avoid those backbreaking work in the field. By the end of the year 1974, we were prepared to export rice in 1975. Next item I want to cover, building up of institutions. Education, obviously, is a cornerstone of economic development. All I need to tell you that between 1954 to 1972, the primary student population went up from 0.4 million to 2.7 million. I would say that's the most incredible achievement for a small country of 15 million people. South Vietnam had no university in 1955. The first one was moved from Hanoi to Saigon, and within a space of 7 years, we have built 7 more universities to include engineering, agriculture, faculties of medicine, pharmacy, dental school, general administration, all of that within the space of 7 years. Now, I need to also mention roughly about tax reform. The reason I want to say that is because one of the key elements about economic development is transparency of tax and simplicity of tax applications. Those are the very fundamental factors to contribute to economic growth. Now I want to mention a few things about the First Republic institutions. As you know, when the First Republic was established, we inherited from the French nothing in a sense, because the country was designed to serve the interests of the colonial power, not for the country. Therefore, we had to build all the institutions from scratch. I just mentioned 2-3 of them, like Industrial Development Center, the Export Development Center, the Railroad Credit Agency, National Development of Industrial Zone. And in this particular case, this Industrial Development Zone was born in 1957, and to this day is still being developed. Not only that, it has kept the same name, the same French acronym name that was used in 1957. Today, some 61 years later, still the same French acronym. In the Second Republic, we had set up Industrial Development Bank, the Industrial Agricultural Bank, and the National Standard Institutes. Building up of legislations. I just mentioned 3 of them. You can see that we already have a land tiller program, then we have an investment law in 1970, and the National Petroleum Law in 1970. I just want to mention the significant ones, and I will discuss the achievement of each one of those. Two of them are significant. The Agricultural Development Bank, in a way, is not a large bank, but it provides 2 things that the farmers have always needed and never had access to. First, access to credit at the village level. That was never there until this bank was created. Second point to make is this bank here pioneered in microfinancing way before it became popular in other underdeveloped countries. We were doing that in 1971, microfinancing to the farmers. The second agency that is important is National Petroleum and Mine Agency. We set it up in 1971 with the help of experts from the Shah of Iran government. We are talking about 1970. And with the help of major oil companies, we have been able to auction off 2 rounds of offshore concession agreements, and by the August of 1974, we found oil offshore. You can say that it was a stroke of luck, yes, but at the same time, we want to emphasize the reason we got that lucky is because we rely on 2 factors. The private sector to develop. We did not develop our own oil companies. The second, we rely on the know-how, the capital, and the technical know-how of the major oil companies. We will not be able to do that with our own resources. I want to emphasize this very important point. Reliance on the private sector for capital, for know-how, and for management. Looking back, people have kept asking us, are we developing the country or are we in the self-defense mode? I have to say that all my years working in the government, there was never a discussion of nation building, because every day we were fighting fires. We were hoping that we go away, but that doesn't go away. So defense has always been in our mind every day until we find some breathing space that we can think about long-term development. And that was toward 1972, 73, which was already at the end of the Vietnamization war period. What did we leave behind? I have to say three things. We left behind a market economy base. Second, reliance on the private sector. Third, financing to the small farmers. What did we achieve? I'm going to just repeat what Walt Russell, a very well-known development economist, in 1972, he thought Vietnam was on the move and ready for taking off. I'm surprised to hear to see what he had written that time, because I wasn't prepared for that statement. But I can tell you, if the events of 75 didn't happen, we had a good chance at developing the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so now we have Pham Thi Hong Ha from the Institute of History in Hanoi, and she's going to give a paper on reconceptualizing foreign aid, the United States Commercial Import Program for the RVN, 1955 to 1975.
Dear Mrs. Chairwoman and dear distinguished speaker, today I'm very honored to be here. Firstly, I'd like to give my thanks to the organizer of the workshop and especially Professor Trường Vũ. I also I would like to give the sincere thanks to Mr. Phạm Kim Ngọc, former Minister of Economy, the Republic of Vietnam since 1969 to 1972, and Mr. Nguyễn Đức Cường, former Minister of Trade and Industry since 1972 to 1975, for your supporting and all the previous comments on my paper. I appreciate that. Today I would like to present about the reconceptualizing foreign aid, the United States Commercial Import Program for Republic of Vietnam. As you know, during 20 years, the U.S. economic aid to Republic of Vietnam maybe nearly 8.5 billion US dollar, and in which it includes three main components. The first is the Commercial Import Program. It's so-called CIP. The second is Food for Peace, and the third is Project Aid. So in which the CIP often covers the largest percent of economic aid. And here I would like to show you briefly about the chart of the scheme of the Commercial Import Program. Look at the chart, you will see that there's many actors involved in the process. From the US side, we have the US government, US producers, US exporters, and from Vietnamese side, we have the Vietnamese importers, commercial banks, national bank, and Rvn government. So who did benefit from this process? So the nature of the commercial import program was to inject a large amount of money into Rvn economy in an indirect way through consumer goods. In the CIP, the US did not provide money directly to Rvn government for fear that the latter would treat it as the part of national reserve and use the money at will. Instead, the US granted the Rvn an annual budget to have the latter import products for daily consumer needs. So we will back the chart later. And this research begins with a series of questions. The first is, why did the US have to set up the CIP with the complicated mechanism instead of giving dollars or transferring goods directly to Rvn government? The second is, why did the US continue to maintain and finance the CIP for Saigon despite the opposition in the US Congress and about its corruption and deviation? And the third, were Rvn's government, Vietnamese importers, Vietnamese bankers, totally passive receivers of aid and obedient followers of US orders? In answer to this question, my paper would like to present firstly about the CIP and its complex aid providing procedures. Second, explain how the CIP helped US goods dominate Rvn's market and supported the US domestic manufacturing sector. Demonstrate how Rvn government, bank, and importers utilized the program to their advantage. And the last, I offer a comparison between the US CIP program for Rvn and that for South Korea to demonstrate how local contexts shape the aims and effects of foreign aid in very different ways. According to the material from US and Rvn government, the main functions of the CIP, firstly, to supply domestic markets with foreign imported goods without consuming the foreign currency reserve of the Rvn government. And the second was to generate a budget in Vietnamese currency to finance defense operations and social economic development projects. And here we back the chart I just told you before. So look at the chart. I would like to explain briefly about the process. You can start with the US government. So at the beginning of each fiscal year, the US administration would approve a fixed amount in US dollars to be used for CIP, and US did not transfer the sum to Rvn government. Instead, it only notified the latter that they had been granted an amount to import foreign products, and in return, Rvn government would notify Vietnamese importers and invite them to submit application for buying products. And in order to buy foreign products, Vietnamese importers have to pay the sum, but in Vietnam though, to the commercial banks, and this money put into the counterpart fund in National Bank, and the money was administered by US and released to Rvn government to use for military or social economic projects. And upon receiving confirmation from Rvn National Bank that the importer had a complete payment, the US aid in Washington via banks would pay US exporters for their products, and the payment made in US dollars, and then the commodities would then be transported to the South Vietnam. by this process, U.S. had gained two purposes. First is to achieve the political purposes. This process was a very clever device of U.S. administration to raise additional funds from local Vietnamese sources to finance the war effort in South Vietnam. In the process, when the Vietnamese importer receive the import license, they have to pay goods in Vietnam dong, and the payment put into the counterpart fund in National Bank. And you see the counterpart fund, maybe 70% made to the fund came from the CIP, from Vietnamese importer, and most of the fund spent on the defense purpose rather than economic development. And the second is achieving economic goals. United States spend money on CIP, but actually spend directly on domestic production of the US. So actually, the money was financed to US manufacturers. The US want to secure South Vietnam as a new and fertile market for US import products, and through which to support the growth of US manufacturing sector. Besides, US established many terms and conditions to grant US producers and companies privileged access to South Vietnam markets, products so quickly and in large quantities. Here you see the chart you had shared with Vietnam. Looking at the chart, you see that although the process brought many benefits for US exporters, but it did not mean that the process of aid giving in the CIP was solely decided by the US. The aid program will not operate smoothly and quickly if without the Vietnamese actors. And this section we saw that the volume of kind of aid was substantially decided by Rvn government, Vietnamese banks, and Vietnamese importers. So firstly, about the Rvn government, a major actor in shaping of the CIP was the Rvn government, which utilized this program as an important means to achieve many economic goals, particularly in containing inflation and increasing state revenue, like Mr. Nguyễn Đức Cường just said that. And in order to get these economic goals, Rvn government carry many active measures to expand the CIP. For example, maintain a high exchange rate between the Vietnam dong and US dollar. And this measure to bring more profit to Vietnamese importers and increase the volume of CIP, intentionally facilitate the import of goods within the CIP through taxes. The second actors, another actor that contribute to the CIP is the Vietnamese commercial banks. The largest need for credit in South Vietnam was credit for export and import. And about 80 to 90% of credit provided by Vietnamese bank were used for import. And Vietnamese commercial bank also conduct many measures to speed up the importation process. For example, allow importers to pay deposit worth maybe 20 to 30% of the value of goods they want to import if the imports were made in the US, but if made in other countries, 100% deposit. The interest rate for loans planting for purchasing US goods would merely 8 to 9%, while the interest rate for loans to purchase goods produced from other countries were set more than 12%. And I would like to present about the Vietnamese importers. There's many CIP analysis that thought that Vietnamese importer lack of sophistication. He knew and cared little about the particular market for which he imported. But however, I think they're very smart and sophisticated. As businessmen, they reckon that in the wartime condition, it would be a risky business to invest in manufacturing enterprise. At the same time, it was unwise to keep money because money would be developed quickly in the wartime condition. And investing in purchasing and keeping imported goods, therefore, would be a much safer choice. They take full advantage structural environment that favor import, like interest rate loan, and besides, they also made their own active decision to create further advantage for their import business. So the rest of the paper, I offer a comparison between the Republic of Vietnam and Republic of Korea, and you see that that's the economic aid to of U.S. to South Vietnam and South Korea. So for Republic of Korea, similar to the Rvn, South Korea was another major ally of U.S. in Asia. The initial aim of the U.S. aid for South Korea was to meet short-term needs for consumer products than to provide production equipment and materials for long-term development goals. However, since 1960s, U.S. began shifting the aims of its aid program from focusing on assisting war efforts to supporting South Korea to develop its economy, particularly its manufacturing sector. And the reason why, because at the same time, the threat of war in Korea Peninsula no longer loomed large, and political environment in South Korea began to stabilize. And the main dynamic that led to a trend in U.S. aid policy for Korea was the Vietnam War and the new bargaining power South Korea gained from deploying combatant troops in South Vietnam. As for Republic of Vietnam, by contrast, the aim of U.S. aid program has always been to support military operation and war efforts in South Vietnam. And while Rvn government was unable to direct U.S. aid towards developing countries' domestic manufacturing sector, it did not mean Rvn was the passive and obedient followers of U.S. orders. Instead, Rvn government choice to prioritize the import of consumer goods was an active decision to harness as much as benefit possible from very disadvantaged conditions. And I would like to propose three conclusions. First is the scholarly works on aid as the mean neo-colonialism should focus not only on aid as the two aid providers to pursue political aims, but also a crucial means to obtain enormous economic benefit. And aid giving was not a unidirectional process that depends solely on aid providing countries, but a bidirectional process in which volume and forms of aid was substantially determined by Rvn government business from aid receiving nations, and local context shaped the aims and effects of foreign aid in very different way. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now we have Alvin Bui from the University of Washington. He's going to present a paper on brotherly fellowship via sister cities, contours of the Rvn-ROC relationship.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you especially to for inviting me and letting this person who, as of 3 weeks ago, just stepped into his first graduate seminar present. This is some research based on some archival work I've done this past summer on the contours of the Republic of China and Republic of Vietnam's diplomatic relationship. And I apologize in advance if there's historiographical gaps or narrative gaps. I've just started reading the secondary sources. So we began. I like Jason, also like moving around. So this photo didn't quite make it out fine, but it says Chinese Nationalist Embassy in Saigon is bombed on September 19, 1967. Luckily, nobody was killed in this bombing, and only a few embassy staff, chauffeurs, and the like were injured. Luckily, the ambassador was not killed because he, for some reason, called an early meeting, and he was in the back of the compound, whereas the bomb basically destroyed the first half of the compound. So this is 47 Pasteur at the corner of Ham Nhi, if anybody is a Saigon News restaurant, and now it is the state audit of Khu Bak Bun. This is April 2019 on Google Maps. So what did they do to replace this? They decided not to rebuild it on that spot, but they decided to move it over to Hai Ba Cheng and Thang Ngap Tak. And you can see them 2 years later. This is, I would guess this is early 1969 with a few months of construction left to go. And this is a postcard from the inauguration files. Just later that year, they were, this is the inauguration, and a picture from the file where they arrived at it. So as you can see, the new building is built in a temple-like format, Chinese temple. Yeah. And what's up with this building now? There were some upgrades to it. Oh, that picture again. There were some upgrades to it in 2015, and it would eventually become the People's Republic of China Consulate General, also at the same address. So, I think the next slide is, why study the ROC/Taiwan? So, there's actually a few slides here. One is, I want to talk about why I'm studying the ROC/Taiwan, and I wanted to thank 4 people in particular. The first is Chris Gauchas, who discusses sort of South China as this base for not only communists kind of trying to build forces, but also nationalists. And the same nationalists that kind of, in my form, in my thinking, make up the Vietnam Quốc dân Đảng, supposedly died out in the Yên Bai massacre, but suddenly show up again. Somebody had mentioned earlier in, I think Eugene mentioned earlier in the central region, and would show up again in Saigon's oppositional politics by trying to win House seats and participating in National Assembly, in the National Assembly. So that's Chris Gaucha. Second is Sean Fear, with his work on not only the Second Republic in general, but his article about Saigon Goes Global, and that ties in with Lin Han-Nguyen and her kind of corollary talking about Saigon's allies in relation to the Vietnamese allies. Last is, of course, Liu Antan herself, who in her conclusion to her dissertation talks about international anti-communism, internationalist anti-communism. So I wanted to explore one aspect of that, which is Asian anti-communism. In terms of this work, I'm looking at the ROC as a pioneer of the Asian anti-communist nation/movement, and they served as a beacon example for the Rvn's officials' rhetoric. They would mention it frequently. They would talk about Chiang Kai-shek as Canada's leader, and they also had to find non-military methods of supporting the Rvn because they were afraid of a PRC threat of the PRC during the war, which eventually happened anyways. So in this specific case, I cite 2 examples. One, they sent a decorated military background as ambassador with knowledge of anti-communist strategy. And 2, they reoriented sister cities as an alternative form of soft power. So those are the 2 things I'll talk about in the rest of the presentation. First is the ambassador. After a sort of foreign diplomatic kind of like a suit, they decided to send Hu Lin, who served from 1964 to 1972. And he was a decorated Kuomintang veteran and was a commanding general in 1958. And he was picked specifically because of his knowledge of anti-communist strategy. So the Republic of China tried to find a very specific way, find a very specific person that could help the military ambassadors on the ground in Saigon to give advice and high-level strategy. You can see him in the 2 pictures here. At the bottom, he's shaking the hand of Madame Thiệu with Thiệu and Chiang Kai-shek in the background. And at the top, he is Gan Bei-ing with Chen Thiệu, with, of course, Chiang Kai-shek's portrait in the background. So, on the flip side, I also looked at the Rvn ambassadors to the ROC, and of course, there are 2 names that kind of stick out. One of that is Chen Thiệu, who served for 2 or 2.5 years after his exile by Nguyen Can to the Rvn ambassador to the US. Nguyen Cao exiled him further to the ROC, but his friend Thiệu would call him back to serve as the longest-serving Rvn Prime Minister from 69 to 75. In replacement of him as ambassador, Nguyen Thiệu would send his own older brother, Nguyen Van Kieu, to serve as the ambassador to the ROC, and Rvn would serve until the end, until the fall of the Republic. And as you see in that last note there, Thiệu lived in Thiau's Taipei home in April to June of 1975. So I'm showing kind of the usage of this ambassadorship as a way to save face and avoid, these specific generals and usually high-ranking generals from like, oh, why aren't they in a specific position? One, they were afraid, whoever's in command was quite afraid of Kim, in this case, being having another coup and possibly taking power, and same thing with Gi. So it wasn't until Thiệu took command that Kim came back and Thiệu was set in his place. Of course, in terms of ambassadors, I can't remember where I read this, but after Thiệu resigned, the new president, John Ben-Hoon, sent Thiệu as an ambassador, possibly at large, with the first stop at Taiwan. And if we remember, in April 1975, Chiang Kai-shek had just passed away. So kind of this beacon of the anti-communist movement and hopes, kind of dying along with Kim's own resignation, as you can see in the background of both pictures. And then connecting this to the idea of sister cities. So during this whole time, as ambassadors, the ambassadors served as a go-between in terms of helping the cities, at the city level rather than the national level, really use a form of like alternative diplomacy. And before I get into it, a little bit about terminology. So in English, we like to use the term sister cities, whereas in the documents that I was reading, mostly they would use the term tenfo hunde, or shampi in Mandarin. And it was the term, And then occasionally they would use the term tiam, tuan viet, but also occasionally dimoi. So it just depends on who is writing. But hunde, shampi is pretty much the common one. And then it wasn't always obvious in documents which one was the older brother, but in terms of like rhetoric, it was kind of clear that we need to learn from the example of Taipei and Taiwan and our own city. And I might also use the term linkages in the minutes to come, just to shorter. In terms of the kind of historiography or background on sister cities, it really proliferated in the World War II landscape, where cities on the opposite side of World War II were looking for a way to reconciliation and link together in order to rebuild. In terms of Asia, I don't really find a specific example of an Asian city with any other city until 1960, where Tokyo linked with New York City. But I don't think they took it quite as seriously because they never used the concept of a sister city again until 1979. And I think I removed this, but Tokyo today has about 12 sister cities, and Taipei has 51 or 52. Which kind of goes into the next point. Taipei, in light of its diminishing role in the UN, and every year the PRC was going up trying to get a seat or trying to replace their seat in the UN. Taipei started linking in the beginning of the 1960s with Houston, you see, but really picking up towards the late 60s. And in this case, in 1968 with Quezon City, Seoul, and Saigon. So I argue, or hope to argue, that it served as a mechanism for Taiwan/Taipei to maintain an alternative form of diplomatic ties with other nations as their national level diplomatic ties were getting wrecked. So and in this last part, I'm going to briefly compare Saigon's case with that of Da Nang. And before that, I briefly explain, somebody mentioned Chen Ben-Hoon is the mayor of Saigon before, but by the time of Thiau's term, the mayor would be appointed by Thiau, usually a colonel or a lieutenant colonel, and then there was also a municipal city council that was ostensibly voted on by the people of the districts of which they served. And the way they worked together in Saigon's case was the council voted in October 1968 to elect a delegation of 6 members to be sent to Taipei to kind of get their groundwork together to visit Taipei. And they wanted to line this up with the first night of the Asian People's Anti-Communist League to be held in Saigon that December. But the documents also suggest that it's really the national level government that was saying, okay, the municipal council, we approve the municipal council's approval to do this. So it was just really a formality. And I would say that this really inspired Saigon to go out and try to get more linkages. They're saying, okay, Taipei is going out and doing this. Why don't we go out and do it too? So the municipal council and the vice chairman and chairman would every year, every few months, they'd send a proposal to the national government. Hey, let's go to these cities and try to get something done. But really, nothing ever happened outside of Group 1 and occasional visits to Group 2. And I can, more details. But on the other hand, Da Nang and their mayor with Colonel Khoi, it kind of happened a little bit differently. In November 1970, Mayor Khoi sent a letter to his provincial council saying, hey, I'm going to go to Kaohsiung and I'm going to try to get a linkage agreement or talk about it. Little did the provincial council or the national government know that was going to lead to a signing ceremony, eventually later that year in December. Mayor Khoi returns to Da Nang and sends a letter to Minister of Internal Affairs saying, hey, my trip was a success. I've already linked the two cities. Can you please approve it so I can invite a delegation from Kaohsiung to Da Nang to celebrate an anniversary. This kind of sparks some internal debate. The national government decides, hey, that's not cool. They send a letter out to all the provincial chiefs saying, please do not go out. It is by yourself. You need approval from the national government. So much for the sister cities idea in this case. Anyways, they do approve Mayor Khoi's pre-approval of the linkage, and he is able to invite the 6-person delegation to Da Nang. In conclusion, I don't really have a conclusion, I more have future directions. So, since it's early, so in terms of the RVN, like I said, in terms of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and, for example, Sean Fear's work, I want to further explore the Second Republic's efforts to establish nation-state legitimacy through the expansion of its foreign diplomatic corps. So not only at the city level, but also at the nation-state level. And there seems to be a reform of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the late 1960s, potentially more towards a American model of like kind of steps and groups and G1 and G7 and all that stuff. That's more internal. In terms of the ROC, I want to look at their cultural impact on the RVN. There's a Republic of Vietnam Embassy kind of bulletin that says, hey, there are 45% of the movies being shown in the RVN are from the ROC, not the US, not Hong Kong, as we might think. And also the advisors they sent. They didn't send military troops, but they really were working towards a psychological warfare program alongside the Republic of Korea and the Republic of Vietnam. And they were also sending administrative Hanzhan troops, Hanzhan advisors, to advise on that. And my last point was about the Republic of Korea. As we know, the Republic of Korea sent the second most amount of troops after the Americans, and I think there's something to be said about a potential free Asian triumvirate, as I'd like to call it, and supporting what Nguyen Thanh in her big arrow to me says anti-communist internationalism. Thank you.
We now have Mark Seidel, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he'll be speaking on the Ford Foundation in South Vietnam, 1959 to 1974.
Let me start as we're pulling up the PowerPoint by thanking Tong and Holly and all of their colleagues for this tremendous 2-day meeting, and thanking Peter for putting much of what we're going to be talking about or are talking about in a broader perspective that, at least for me, was tremendously helpful. I was struck while Peter was talking about the only piece of this Republican strand that I've had any previous contact with, and that was the very sophisticated constitutionalist thinking that was going on in the South in the late 50s through the early 70s, through 73, 74, 75, all of which pretty much died out, as you know, in 75. And the first time it was disinterred in terms of being used by others was, perhaps not surprisingly, but interestingly for me, because I wrote a little bit about this, thank you very much, was by young constitutional reformers and academics in the North, who began to look back at what the constitutional law professors and others were doing in the South in terms of a constitutionalist Republican tradition, and disinterring that work to the point that it's now being used by legal scholars in the North and elsewhere in Vietnam, and through that process has become a bit more well-known outside Vietnam as well. At any rate, my topic, however, is not that. I'm going to talk very briefly about the Ford Foundation in the South between 1959 and 1974. This project arose because I have a long personal and work interest in the Ford Foundation's episodes in Vietnam, both in the South and in the North after 1991, which I was directly involved with. And in that process, heard a great deal about the Ford Foundation's forays and explorations in the South beginning in about 1958, 1959, and left it alone for many years because there was no particular way of looking at it in great depth in the absence of documentary materials until the previous president of the Ford Foundation, Luis Ubiñas, decided to release millions of pages of Ford Foundation records to the Rockefeller Archive Center in Pocántico, New York, an archive center that many of you, some of you are familiar with, and that material is now available. And when I went to look at it in the hopes of perhaps writing a short piece about the entire Ford engagement, interaction with South Vietnam from about 1959 until the aftermath of 1975, 76, 77, but well before things began in the North in the late 80s, early 90s, I found thousands upon thousands of pages of Ford Foundation records relating to interactions and explorations with the South. Both in the 60s and early 70s, and then again in the late 80s, early 90s, Ford spent quite some time through its Asia staff grappling with whether and how to work in Vietnam. Because I found so much material and began doing interviews which are woefully incomplete, this paper only focuses on one piece of that interaction, and it's just a beginning look at that interaction. And it's really between 1959, when Ford began to take an interest in what was going on in the South, and 1974, when the International Committee of Ford's Board of Trustees approved a program in Vietnam that resulted in, actually the office had already been established, but resulted in the placement of program personnel in Saigon. Some of you may know the people who were placed in Saigon at that point, the hiring of a local staff of about 8 to 10 people, and the beginning of Ford Foundation programmatic activities in the South, which had actually begun a bit in 1973 and then accelerated in 1974, and came to a crashing halt in 1975, for reasons you all know. But the Ford interest in Vietnam as part of a broader interest in working in Southeast Asia began in 1959 with explorations of working with the government, particularly on capacity building. Nothing came of that. But then Ford spent quite a bit of money working with the Brookings Institution from 1960 to 1964 on a program of reforming the finance and tax system. A program that, while there was a sense within the foundation that the program hadn't gone badly, there was also a sense that working with the government as it then existed between 1960 and 1964 was very difficult to do, and that if Ford were to continue and expand its activities in the South, although working on finance and tax system reform had been of some use in that 4 to 5 year period, that Ford would probably want to look at methodologies of working in the South that did not involve working directly with government agencies, which is what this program had done. In short, some useful work had been done, but the process of getting that useful work done, dealing with finance, budgetary, and tax authorities, and the difficulties of working with the government in Saigon at that point, meant that the space and conditions issue was a really difficult issue going forward. Going forward from this, the 1960 to 1964 experience, it became a sort of motif of Ford's work or potential work in Vietnam to avoid entanglement with both the Southern government and the US government. And that was of particular interest to Ford personnel who kept going back and forth into Vietnam, beginning again in '66, and looking at the possibilities of doing programming in Vietnam, the difficulties of working with the government and the search for other actors with which to interact, and at the same time the strong desire not to become a kind of junior partner to USAID and other US government agencies in terms of aid or development work in Vietnam. That left Ford exploring through much of the late 60s various modalities of working in Vietnam, none of which came to a significant level of programming at all, just some sort of small, often individual grants, but nothing major going on. Explorations in education in 1966, a couple of years of re-exploring activities in 1968, 1969, in which, as I discuss at a bit more length in the paper, we began to see a divide among Ford staff that would continue through 1973, 1974, 1975. A group of younger program staff, some of whom had participated in anti-war activities by the early 1970s, who were skeptical about working in the South in the late 60s, early 70s. A group of older, more conservative individuals, including Robert McNamara, who were associated with the foundation and who had their own experiences in working with or working on Vietnam, and were very much disillusioned by those experiences by the time they got into private life, World Bank, Ford Foundation, or other kinds of activities, and opposed those activities. So there was almost at different stages a kind of informal alliance, is probably too strong a term, between the more progressive younger program staff who were skeptical of working in Vietnam and older board members and others like McNamara, sometimes Bundy, who were also skeptical about the ideas of working in Vietnam but were willing to see the explorations go forward. Meanwhile, Ford was involved in two other kinds of activities. One's Vietnam specific and one more regional. The regional one was the Southeast Asia Fellowship Program, which sent more than 100 people from Southeast Asia off to graduate school in the United States and other countries between 1968 and 1978. Most of you are familiar with one or more people who were supported by the Southeast Asia Fellowship Program, even if you don't necessarily know it. It's been a long time since the Southeast Asia Fellowship Program was in effect, but Hoi Tam and many others were supported by the Southeast Asia Fellowship Program back in those days as a capacity building mechanism for intellectuals from around the region. The idea of working with the intellectual community rather than working with government became an important theme in Ford's explorations of working with Vietnam, both because of the negative experience of working with the Ministry of Finance and others from 1960 to 1964, but also the very positive experience of working with the intellectual community and helping them build capacity through PhD programs. The more specific activity, but also one that generated some controversy within the foundation, some discord within the foundation, was programmatic grants to Cornell and Harvard for the support of Vietnamese studies. Some of you are familiar with this, some of you may have even studied this. Beginning in the late 1960s, a series of debates within the foundation, which do play out in the documents, I was glad to see, about how broadly to support Vietnamese studies in the United States, why to focus on one or two already reasonably well, or in Harvard's case, very well endowed institutions, and that series of discussions. Interestingly, that series of discussions never really ended and carried through to the evaluation stage of these grants, where a very frank evaluation pointed out that while some good work had been done by supporting Vietnamese studies in Cornell and Harvard during this 6 to 7 year period, Ford would have been better off with a broader program of support, including to institutions that were not so well endowed in this field. One of the useful results of this process were strong links to the Cornell group and the working with the Cornell group to establish ties with the North, which was important to the foundation going forward. Beginning in 1973, the foundation engaged in very intensive explorations of whether to work in the South, whether to establish a program, whether to establish an office, and very quickly decided that the older patterns of working directly with government were not working in many other countries and would not work in Vietnam, and that Ford would shift to working in the intellectual and cultural fields. At the same time, for about 4 years, for about 2 years, Ford worked through these processes of establishing some consensus within the foundation overcoming the objections, the doubts of younger program staff who were doubtful about the utility of working in the South. One of the ways in which that happened was by sending many young program staff in their fields to Saigon to explore program possibilities. A number of them came back far more friendly to the idea of working in the South, and particularly working with South Vietnamese intellectuals than before they had gone. But by the time this came to the Board of Trustees at the Foundation, there was still significant doubt. And it came to the Board of Trustees and the Foundation in March 1974, particularly to the International Committee. By that point, there was doubt, but also some consensus within the staff that it was worth establishing an experimental program of grants to intellectual and cultural actors, institutions in the South, and seeing where that would go. At the same time, Ford was very much engaged in approaches to the North and to the NLF as well, and the board decided to continue those approaches. Those approaches did not work out in terms of programmatic activities with the North until 1989, 1990, 1991, as some of you know, but those activities continued in 1973 and 1974. Throughout this process, and really beginning in the mid to late 1960s, the sense in Ford, as I say here, as one of the Ford officers said, if the Foundation's explorations have identified one central theme, it is for Vietnamese research and training and thinking to replace U.S. Embassy AID-based research and staff work. That was a theme that, again, unified younger program staff within the Foundation who were skeptical of working with the South, and older, particularly members of the Board of Trustees, who had spent time working with the government and did not want to see their post-government institutions, Ford or others, become too enmeshed with the South Vietnamese government. As a result, the decision to work on cultural and intellectual life, to try to build Vietnamese capacity in intellectual and cultural spheres, to stay away from direct interactions and engagement with the government where possible, and to call this program experimental and an initiative, while at the same time establishing an office in Saigon and beginning a pretty speedy process of grant making in 1974 and 1975, indicated that the Foundation was moving ahead rapidly with the ideas of beginning a significant program in the South. That's my last slide, and as you know, the story, which I only carry through here, to the decision by the Ford Board's International Committee to proceed with programming in the South, that decision and the activities which resulted then ended in 1975. As I point out in the paper, that also resulted in the deaths of 2 Ford Foundation Vietnamese staff members in May, June 1975, and a hiatus in activities, although not a break in contact with Vietnam, only to be picked up again in the late 80s, early 90s with the program that began with Hanoi, but also worked in Saigon as well. So that's where the research is so far. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here, and thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you to all the speakers for being on time. So we've got. I think it's not the question. Yes?
It's on the record. So I have a question for Hal Pat.
Speak up.
So it seemed like the Rvn and U.S. officials knew. It seemed like both Rvn. So it seemed like both Rvn and U.S. officials knew from early on that the commodity import program had this sort of a kind of adverse effect on the development of manufacturing in South Vietnam. And there were promises all the way back to the Kennedy administration that they would try to address this problem. But for some reason, it always seemed that they would point to Congress as being some kind of obstacle to fixing the problem of kind of prioritizing consumer goods over capital goods in the aid program. So I don't know exactly what that means when they blame Congress for it. Is it because Congress was too afraid of kind of changing the aid so that it could be dispersed without the counter funds mechanism? Because that would take away money from U.S. manufacturers, or is it because they were afraid that it would increase corruption, or were they afraid that that would increase that it would sort of increase inflation if they prioritize capital goods over consumer goods?
Thank you for your question. The U.S. congressman criticized the CIP in Vietnam because of many reasons. Firstly, criticized the administration of U.S. aid in Vietnam. Their managed is not good. They lack the corruption in Vietnam, and the second is criticize the exchange rates between the Vietnam dong and U.S. dollar. Because as you know, the value of Vietnam dong at the time is higher than the actual value and higher than the exchange rate in the black market. So that is not good for U.S. exporter. So they criticize about that. Yeah.
Let me try to answer the question you asked about why didn't we import capital goods instead of consumer goods. In a market economy, who determines what to buy, what to import? Not the government. That's very important. Second, in the case of a country at war, why do I want to import capital goods when all we need is one rocket to destroy the factory? That has happened before and continues to happen no matter what you do, because factory is a sitting duck. All it takes is one grenade and the factory is gone. Keep that in mind. Not that we want to import consumer goods. Who wants to import capital goods? Not somebody who is rational. We won't want to do that. And therefore, in the market economy, we get to take that into account. I just want to clarify that, okay?
My name is Trần Quang Minh, a former Vice Minister of Agriculture in the Thiệu administration. I want to add something that may be of interest to you, to Mr. Kern's land reform. Land reform in Republican Vietnam is a very enduring legacy for the loser side. The winner side try their hardest best to erase the massive rural social revolution for 12 years to no avail. In fact, they miserably failed in that attempt to the point that they have to bring back the concept of land reform, basically the land to the tiller program, at the point of near starvation, when people have to eat sorghum, bawbaw, like pigs and chickens. Excuse me. When I went to Cornell University for the first symposium on the Vietnam War. A professor of economics there told me about the news of Vietnam resuming not only rice export, but become the #1 rice exporters in the world because they just beat Thailand for that. I almost cried at the news. Later, I read somewhere on the internet the news that the Land to the Tiller program was at the origin of the complete dismantling and utter destruction of the Marxist collectivized agriculture in the North, as argued by an American historian. I almost cry again. Old people do cry a lot when they are happy and gratified. And in fact, if I am in the 20s now, instead of the 80s, I would ask Professor Temporal to support a PhD thesis on how the Vietnamese went from eating sorghum like pig and chicken to from Vietnam becoming the #1 exporter of rice in the world. In fact, I told my oldest grandson the other day, to go into doing that sort of study, but he said, I want to be on the winning side, so he joined the U.S. Naval Academy.
Anyone else?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Ben Tai from Columbia University, and I have a question for Mr. Kern. In your presentation, you indicate that the inflation jumped from 5% in the first decade to 35% in the second decade. So I wonder what were the contributing factor for the increase in the inflation, and was there anything to do with the CIP program?
Your question is, what is the contributing factor to the higher inflation in the second decade? Very simple. With the withdrawal of US troops, the Vietnamization effort means we have to increase our troop strength up to 1 million of men under arms, whereas the US had withdrawn over 500,000 down to about 24,000 by the end of the year 1972. So the increase in troop strength means higher budget, means higher deficit, and therefore, in simple terms, inflation was due to budget deficit. There's no way to avoid that. As a matter of fact, it is almost impossible to avoid that. And we found that we were pretty lucky that we could manage to less than 35%. And there was one time it was running 60%, 70%, and it could have been what we call runaway inflation. Luckily, we were able to manage it to within 30, 40%. So in summary, the reason is budget deficit.
Yeah, question for Mark. I'm a little bit surprised that the foundation was thinking of working with Hanoi during the late 60s, but I'm really surprised that they were thinking of working with the NLF. Can you talk a little bit more about that idea?
Yeah, there's most of what's available to document this is about the South. Less is available, but it's very clear that there were multiple approaches to the North and at least one invitation for Ford personnel to go to the North in 73, which couldn't be taken up for complicated internal reasons at that point. But there's also references to approaches to the NLF And former colleagues had said to me that there had been direct approaches to the NLF. I think some of this comes from the fact that the person that the foundation had appointed to run its programming operations in the South, a gentleman whom some of you may know and whom I know named Charlie Benoit, a name that may be familiar to some of you who were of the older generation and who still lives in the region. Charlie had some links to NLF personnel that enabled him to bring a New York Times correspondent, James Markham, into NLF territory in 1972 and 1973. A matter that was severely criticized by the then US ambassador in Saigon and was subject to some discussion within the foundation as well. But I think beginning around that time or connected to that time, there was the sense that if the foundation was going to have discussions about doing programming in the South and in the North, it wasn't going to ignore the NLF entirely, that conversations with the NLF were possible through Paris, if not only through sending messages within Vietnam. Nothing came of this. More came of the discussions with the North, and as many people in the room know, eventually an entire program of activities in an office came out of the discussions with the North. But the decision was to approach all three actors, as it were, and see what happened with the hope of doing programming with any or all of the three if that happened, but the South happened first.
I have a question for Alvin, and thank you very much for mentioning my dissertation. That was very kind of you. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the temporal scope of the research. It looks like you want to focus on the Second Republic. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about why you chose to focus on a particular period or a particular avenue or a particular type of language. If we could talk about maybe like a larger project.
Sure.
That question made sense.
Simple answer is I'm not sure. This started initially when I first applied to grad school. The first go around, I thought about, I'm really interested in Vietnam Kuoksandang and following it from southern China to Saigon to parliamentary opposition and Quang Nam, kind of like I found like a list of member names. I was like, this is fantastic. But what changed? I really wanted to learn Chinese and figured that there's this connection here that's important. Possibly just looking at ambassador lists, I'm like, what is Chen Kim doing in Taipei? What is Pham Sun Tu doing in Seoul? It's Nguyen Phan Kieu. That name sounds familiar. So that really got me, it got me to the Second Republic. And the reason I don't really mention First Republic, and it's kind of glossed over, is it seems that the First Republic's Ministry of Foreign Affairs wasn't really operating on non-US stuff. Right? There's very few documents, and where they are, it's just like stacked in one big thing, and I go through them, and there'll just be reports, kind of reporting reports, and it's not really until Second Republic, and again, Sean Fear's stuff is great for that. It's like, they're really trying to make an effort to go out and get there. So that has drawn me more interest, but I might end up having to go back to southern China in terms of location. And time, that would, it could go all the way back to what Dung Vu said about the Republic in China, right? And how does that go us all the way to Republic in Vietnam? And looking at Sun Yat-sen as basically a progenitor of republicanism, whatever that may mean.